Hi, everyone. Sorry for that. We had some technical glitches. My name is Jean-Luc Solance. I'm calling from Rossall in Herefordshire, landlocked Herefordshire. But it's great to be with you today to introduce you to the work of the Marine Conservation Society. There it is on the chest. I'm going to talk a little bit about the oceans, first of all, before we go into some of the work that we do. But first of all, you need to know about why we do it and why we are working in such an incredible place. So it is a blue planet. We all are aware of that. 70% of the surface area of this planet is covered by water. But in actual fact, there's about 99% of the living space that is water. Now, that's fundamentally important because all of the living that occurs in the oceans is reabsorbing nutrients, carbon, lots of chemical and biological processes in the ocean that are replicated on land. But in the ocean, there is just that much more critical biomass and activity and life going on that is so fundamental to this planet. Now, what you would have been inspired about, like I was, perhaps is the Blue Planet series. And it is not, it's not a lie to say that the work of David Attenborough and the Natural History Unit and the BBC has been fundamental at being really important at raising awareness of the oceans. He's done series on coral reefs, he's done a series on reptiles, he's done a series on birds, he's done a natural history of the entire planet. So without that awareness, I don't think we'd be in a position where there would be so much interest in the oceans. So we're delighted with that. But what we're going to talk about a little bit is the threats of the oceans. So to a greater extent, sadly, we've overexploited everything that is large in the oceans. We've really had a huge consequential effect on the living matter in the seas. We basically have eaten most of it. We've developed in many coastal areas. And now we're in a generation, I think, which is really exciting because the awareness of the impact we have had in the oceans, particularly in the last 120 to 140 years, which is the period of industrial revolution since the advent of steam-powered engines and then oil-powered engines and the growth associated with it. We really understand the consequences of overuse of natural resources. The use of the word sustainable has been used for about 30 years, but the way we're sustaining the current levels of use of the planet, it might be sustainable in terms of a business sense, but it's not sustainable in terms of natural resources. So that awareness has grown. Extinction Rebellions and other sorts of campaigns have been absolutely vital at understanding that. We've seen through the use of resources on land and at sea, the damage to habitats by the extraction of those organisms themselves, but also the collateral damage of extracting them. We've seen over the past 20 years the real concerns to do with ocean warming and acidification, which I'll go into on Friday next week. And really, quite interestingly, is a thesis by Jeremy Jackson, who published in about 2004, a great marine biologist. And he talked about the rise of slime, which is essentially a thesis that we're going to get more and more eutrophication events, and we are going to a simpler system of organisms in the seas as more complex organisms can't cope with the acidification, can't cope with the temperatures in the seas. So there's a considerable concern at the moment that we are going through something called the Anthropocene, and the Anthropocene is the loss of wildlife to such a degree it's like one of the major catastrophic events, like when the extinction of the dinosaurs happened, and when we also had increase of acidification in the past due to carbon increasing in our waters. And what we've done to a degree, I want to show this image to you. I know it's a bit clumsy, and I hope you'll bear with me. But essentially, we fish down the food chain. You can see this great arrow from large fish, cod, which are in the water column and also in the seabed. And we are the greatest consumers of the large fish, be they predatory fish like sharks and cod. And then those animals that those fishes fed on are the ones we're now fishing on, like the midwater species like whiting and sardines. Now, those are the remnants of what was a much richer ecosystem over here, and we moved to a much simpler ecosystem over here. And I alluded to the rise of slime, and you can see these jellyfish, which are depicted by this very clear graphic. But again, I talked about the collateral damage. So we've not only is the harvesting of those organisms leading to a simpler food chain, a simpler amount of organisms in the water column, but also on the seabed, we go from complex, biodiverse, rich seabeds to more simpler seabeds, more homogeneous seabeds, you might like. So we can see over the past 100 years this effect, and sadly it's happened to a greater degree before we started to sort of record it quantitatively. So it's really important to understand these changes and how they can be reversed, and I'll talk about some of those solutions in the next few minutes. Added to that, we have the climate change issues, which is obviously a big degree, a massive concern, one that will affect all our lives over the next 20 to 50 years, and probably in a negative sense. So sea levels are rising, and we're seeing the greater acidification of the oceans because there's much more carbon being put into the oceans, which is not being absorbed and being turned into carbonic acid, which unfortunately erodes the skeletons of many marine organisms. So those are concerns to which we all have a part to play. It can't just be the NGOs, marine conservationists and politicians. We all have to adjust our behaviours to deal with that. And we all have heard, and some of these lectures have gone into the impacts of ocean warming on acidification and bleaching of corals and the problems with plankton and other parts of the ecosystem. So ocean warming is a real concern for us. And then there are these dead zones which are increasing in their number around coastal systems, and that's where you get a leaching of the nutrients from land practices into quite calm embayments, usually, or coastal seas, and these create conditions for bacterial growth after the huge blooms of algae that we might see. I've got a couple of images here which aren't great, but they depict, look what's happening in Asia here. This is a mat of a type of heavily blooming algae. This guy can completely cover himself in it. Here's an algal bloom off Detroit in the United States. Here's an algal bloom occurring in another coastal region. And here's a dinoflagellate bloom, which is a red tide, a spectacular bloom over. And these blooms can occur over hundreds of kilometers squared. And more the oceans are becoming prone to these. And luckily, thanks to certain regulations around Europe and the world, we are starting to see a cessation, a reduction of the amount of nutrients we're putting into coastal ecosystems. Absolutely vital if we're going to recover many of the functioning parts of the ecosystem which support our life. So really vital things are happening. So I want to talk about some of the work that Marine Conservation Society has done. So we started in 1977 with the Underwater Conservation Year. And David Bellamy worked with us, Professor David Bellamy, who I think passed away last year. And he founded the organization with Dr. Bob Earle, who's a benthic ecologist like I am. That means you are interested in what happens on the seabed with the organisms that are in the seabed. And we started this year of understanding the sea by diving in it. And that led to a really wonderful program that MCS has been part of and been the coordinator of for, since 1977, called Sea Search. And Sea Search is a program whereby professional marine biologists train citizen science divers to undertake data recording of what's happening in the marine environment. The MCS officially started in 1983 under the name Marine Conservation Society in a shed in Herefordshire. Not very auspicious, not very marine, you might say. But actually, we're quite central for the United Kingdom, ironically. It's 4 hours to Newcastle, it's 4 hours to Penzance. So we actually, I think, ironically, I live here, we have pretty good access to lots of parts of our coast, 3.5 hours to North Wales, about 5 hours to Kent. So you could say we're in the right place for a UK-wide organisation. We also have offices in Scotland and in Cardiff as well, and now in London. So we're becoming more established around the country with hubs of people who are doing good work in those areas. Now we have about 60 staff. We have 11,000 members and supporters and 15,000 volunteers involved in our beach cleans, which is probably the thing that most people know us for. And that's spectacularly successful. I think there's something like 800 coordinators to look after those 15,000 volunteers that in September clean the beaches of the United Kingdom. Most importantly, we gather data from those beach cleans, and the data provides us with the ammunition by which we can campaign and lobby to different groups as to the provenance of that litter. Obviously, we know about the plastic pollution. It was described beautifully by David Attenborough in Blue Planet 2, and we now are in the position we really know what the provenance of that litter is, and most of it is from us. It's not from necessarily industry or from the fishing industry. It's mostly from the public going to the beach and dropping their litter, or litter being derived from practices further upriver that is then washed down the river. I live on the River Wye. I canoe on the River Wye, and I often see litter from unfortunate despolation by our behaviour, and we're just a bit sloppy. And what's really interesting about this lockdown phase, you might have noticed it yourselves, is there's a lot less litter. So another thing that I think I just want to re-emphasize as well is the amount of effort our volunteer diving programs have. So there are tens of thousands of hours of recording that have been built up since the 1980s. And these have gone into databases that allowed marine protected areas to be set up. Now, I can't say enough about how wonderful that program is to provide the information to our nature conservation advisors all around the country who support our work. SNH have just refunded us, that's Scottish Natural Heritage. And that work gives us the information by which marine protected areas are set up, by which we understand if eutrophication effects are happening, by which we understand if a trawl vessel might go over a vulnerable habitat, as happened in Scotland in the last few years, where vulnerable lime area beds were trawled over. So it's a really important thing that those citizen scientists do. And of course, they then become advocates for the ocean as well after they're trained. So it's not just us in our offices who are speaking up for the oceans, it's the public as well. So let me go into a little bit of detail about the programs that we do. We used to do something called Adopt a Beach, where we took water quality data from lots of beaches around the United Kingdom. And this was really fundamental in providing the right ammunition in publishing a guide of which beaches were healthy to bathe within. So much so, I believe, that the European Commission and the United Kingdom started to do their own assessments of water quality and bathing water quality. And that has led to really much improved water quality in the past 20 years and water treatment facilities. We may complain about our bills that we have to pay but for the past 20 years, we've seen a marked improvement in the state of bathing waters, so that we can feel pretty confident that most of the places we bathe in the United Kingdom are safe to bathe in. And that's largely because of my predecessors in our organisation who saw this problem. Beachwatch is our litter programme that records litter pollution rates every September with those thousands of volunteers, and provides the data to assess where the provenance of that litter is and how things are residual. And the residual litter is really from plastics turning into microplastics and really infiltrating into the marine ecosystem. Quite worrying. And that will stay with us for a large amount of time as particles get smaller and smaller. I think this work and publishing the data of it embarrasses people who are responsible for this, governments, regulators, and the people who are meant to deal with these issues for us. So it's really important that we carry on with this work. And we've also done work at the very highest levels of courts. We've taken cases to the Aarhus Convention because there's and I worry that it's coming back. There's a lack of ability for the public to represent themselves, or NGOs to represent themselves for the environment in court. And that's absolutely vital to hold our governments to account, to make sure that they are looking after the environment to our interest. And I don't necessarily feel confident that at the moment that's the way we're going to go. We do need to have more access to justice and the ability to take court cases which aren't too expensive for our citizens to do. But we've done it once or twice in the UK, and when we do it, it's unbelievably powerful. You will have all heard of Client Earth. I myself have worked with Client Earth in London to try and illustrate the problem of trawling through marine protected areas. And that had a very powerful effect because we were threatening the government with judicial review, and that stopped that activity in many of our inshore marine protected areas. So we can be pleased with that work. Let me go into another program, the fisheries program. Now, the fisheries program, much like I described with the water quality work and the work we do with litter, it really has shown and illustrated where we are overfishing, and you will know about our fish online advice. And we provide a pocket good fish guide every year with really good data on the most sustainable fisheries that you, the consumer, can choose from. The reason this was done was about 20 years ago, a colleague of mine called Bernadette Clark realized that governments weren't listening enough. So she said, why don't I take the data of the published levels of fishing of different stocks straight to the consumer? Let's bypass governments because they're not doing enough. And that had a massive effect because all of a sudden industry got involved, especially importantly, the supermarkets. Now, the supermarkets, although there aren't many of them relative to the amount of fishing that's going on, they produce or provide most fish, whether it's processed, i.e. your cod in batter, or a meal, a ready-made meal, or the fillets in the wet fish section. 80% of our fish, I think, more or less, is sold through the supermarkets. So if we manage to tell them what the good fisheries were and enable them to inform their consumers of what you can buy with impunity, or to an understanding that fishery is being better managed, it starts to pressure the market. So I work with the fisheries team, about 5 or 6 people doing all this sort of work as well as policy work. So they rate hundreds of fisheries every year to make sure that their advice is really important. And I urge you to actually, if you are a consumer of fish, to be more Catholic in your choice of fish, to take the pressure off the major stocks, particularly at the moment when this outbreak of COVID is a problem, because we need to eat the fish that our consumers are buying, our fishermen are catching. And those are wider ranging than the fish that we generally consume. So particularly if you live at the coast, go to your local port, talk to your local small-scale fisherman and ask him what he can offer you. And you might eat a lot of crab and lobster, which would be fantastic for them and their businesses. So that's a little bit about our fisheries work. And then I work in something called the Ocean Recovery Team. The reason why we are calling it the Ocean Recovery Team, because it's absolutely vital that we recover our oceans. We don't just protect them. In fact, you could say the word Marine Conservation Society is the wrong word of what we want to achieve. We don't want to conserve the marine environment as it currently is. We want to make it much richer, much better, much more productive. Because at the moment, we believe we're kind of scraped. We're not in the position where we can see a true recovery. We think we've started. We started with marine protected areas that stopped trawling. We've started with certain fisheries that are doing better, but we need to massively expand the zones that are protected from all forms of fishing, which we have effectively just 4 tiny ones, one in Scotland, one in the Bristol Channel, and 2 others, which are tiny. But we could expand this measure to be much wider. So, that in a nutshell is what the Marine Conservation Society does. We also have worked to a certain extent on some of the larger migratory species like turtles and basking sharks. I've had the privilege of working on basking sharks for a number of years. I think we have had a talk on Lizzie Daly's work website about basking shark conservation. So that's been a privilege to work with those organisms. We described in the country where there are hotspots of those organisms. So another project worked on turtle distribution and turtle legislation in the Turks and Caicos Islands. This is one of our overseas territories. We now have an officer who's working in the overseas territories. So there's a lot of wide-ranging activities that we do, but I wanted to give you an overview of what we do, which was important for you to understand the history of our society. I want to talk, maybe I'll introduce you a little bit about me, because you might want to know about how I got into ocean conservation. I did a degree at Liverpool University in marine biology. I went to the Great Barrier Reef for a year and worked on various projects, particularly projects on how fish interacted with their juveniles, in a sense where these wonderful fish called Acanthochromys polyacanthus brooded their young. The schools started quite large, but as the juveniles got older and older, the numbers got less and less. So I really understood a bit about reef ecology from that point forwards. And then I went and did a PhD in Jamaica, which was really affected by overfishing and eutrophication. So it was very depauperate. That means there wasn't many rich corals or fish life. And there I understood the grazing pressure of sea urchins. And in other other parts of my work, then I moved into expedition science, started working with volunteers in around 2000. And then I got the job at MCS in around 2002. So I've been here ever since then. So there's a couple of questions that have come in. Again, sorry about the late start. We had some technical issues. The difference between eutrophication and ocean acidification. Eutrophication is where you pump lots of nutrients, phosphates, nitrates, things like fertilizers on land in arable systems. So if you go for a walk in your countryside and you see lots of flat land, which is where you get the crops growing, often there's fertilizer that's put on them to boost the growth of those crops. Now, if you don't have a very good catchment program, that means if you're not looking after the land near rivers, a lot of those fertilizers with the nutrients and phosphates will get washed straight into the rivers, out to sea. And then because there's nutrients there, all of the plankton, the plants that grow in the seawater, they bloom massively and quickly. And then they die. And when they die, they're consumed by bacteria, and the bacteria use all the oxygen that's in the water column, and that can lead to fish kills and all sorts of long-term problems from all the marine life that needs oxygen in it. So that's eutrophication. Ocean acidification is created by too much carbon going into the marine ecosystem in the form of carbon dioxide that splits into carbonic acid. If you add another carbon dioxide molecule to it, that creates carbonic acid, and that will try and lock onto the calcium in the shells of marine organisms. And that process creates calcium carbonate, carbon dioxide, but it sadly erodes the skeletons of marine organisms. And as our pH, that means the acidity level is going down, we're becoming more acid in our seas. And this is a real problem for juvenile fish, maybe the behavior of cuttlefish, a type of squid-like organism in UK seas. Everything in the marine environment has a problem with ocean acidification, and we're concerned about what might happen. So I had another question about how people can help. Well, I did mention them already. Come on one of our beach cleans. Also, please be aware of the fish you're consuming. Be cautious about it. And if you talk to your mum and dad, if you're a kid, maybe you want to try something a little bit more exciting, a little bit more different. Maybe you want to try some shellfish, maybe some cockles, some mussels. Those can be rope grown. So rope grown mussels are very environmentally friendly. So there's all sorts of things you can do in the choices you make in life. You could decide to cycle rather than to drive to work. You could decide to walk rather than drive. Can think about where you go on your holidays. Maybe you would consider not flying. So there are all sorts of things we can do. So I think I've spoken for quite a long time now. It would be a pleasure to talk to you about the Marine Conservation Society, what we do. Do get in touch. Do join us. This is a really important time for us. We're all working from home, but we're trying really hard. And when we come out of this, we think we do truly believe that climate change and what we do with the oceans to manage them more sensitively will be so important for the future well-being of the citizens of the planet. You, myself, and others. So I want to thank you for joining us finally, and take a look at the work we do on our website. Thank you very much.